Hi viewers, today I'm going to show you how to implement a GraphQL API using Python, Graphene and Django. So what is GraphQL? GraphQL is a query language. It was invented by Facebook back in 2015 as a better way of doing interprocess communication than very popular REST API methodologies. So it's because it just serves like REST. It serves over HTTP and solves some drawbacks of REST as well. And some of the major problems that it solves uh, is the problem of overfetching and underfetching of REST APIs. For example, in a REST API, you might have a resource or an endpoint that you request to return, get all the books, for example. It will return all the books with all the properties and attributes that you have implemented as part of your REST API implementation. And there is no way for you to specify, for example, I just need only the title, the author, and the description of this REST API. But it will just return anything and everything that is implemented as part of that particular endpoint. So that's the problem of overfetching. And it also has this underfetching problem. Sometimes your REST API might not be returning everything that you need. For example, let's say your get books, for example, return a set of attributes, but it might not return everything about the user. For example, author, for example, authors other books, for example, if he has authored other books, for example, that may be implemented as another endpoint, for example. Like, then you have to pass in that particular author and get all the books which has been written by that particular author. So that as an underfetching problem. So GraphQL solves this problem by trying to give users an option to return all the required data in one particular call with one particular endpoint. You just have to give one endpoint and one call, specify all that you want, and you get it from one particular query. So this solves the problem of overfetching and underfetching, and also inherently reduces the round trip time, for example, that has to go over the network to fetch all these details. So this is a key functionality that is needed. The key thing for modern applications, mobile applications and web application that needs high performance, for example, that's something crucial. And if you are looking into developing a performant application, GraphQL is a good option for you to look into. So consider that if you are implementing a performant if you do want to implement a performant mobile application and a web application, and GraphQL is certainly something that you need to evaluate and see. So for more details about the GraphQL and its advantages, I wrote a blog post naming Embracing GraphQL. So I encourage you to look into that as well. I'll put this link in the description section. And so in this video, we'll be looking into how to implement a GraphQL using Python and a library for GraphQL named Graphene, and also a popular web framework in Python named Django. So for that, we need to first have Python installed and all the prerequisites installed. So first, let's look into that. To run Python applications, we need to have Python interpreter installed. Head on to python.org and then click on Downloads. For your operating system, you will see the latest version of the Python. So I happen to be running Mac OS 10 in this machine, so it just shows me Python 3.9.2, which is the latest version as of today. So if you click on that, you will be prompted to download the package version of Python. And once you download it, you can double click that and follow the on-screen instructions. And if you are running a Linux distribution, it's likely that you have Python already installed, but we can check that as well. So I'm not going to do this thing now because I have Python already installed in my Mac OS. So I'll skip that, and you can also see other operating system specific executables, installation executables. For example, if you just head on to Windows, you'll be able to download Windows specific binaries as well. So let me just connect to a remote machine where I have an Ubuntu server running. So let's see how to get Python installed there if it's not already in place. So this is my Ubuntu LTS version that I'm running. So you can see that from this, and as you can see, I'm running Ubuntu 18.04 LTS version, so long-term support version. So to see if Python is installed, I can just check Python -v. This should bring back and tell me the Python version if I have Python installed, but apparently I don't have Python installed. Most of desktop workstation specific Linux distributions should have Python installed, but there can be situations where it might not be installed due to various purposes. So to get it installed, so in this case it also shows me how to get Python installed. So you can just run this particular command over here. So as you can see, it's now installed. So let me see if it's installed. Not yet. Okay, so it says the Python 3 is already installed, so that could possibly be due to the fact that I chose to run Python -v. So rather I should have run Python 3 -v. Yeah, so it shows me as Python is installed, so that's good news. So then we also need to have a Python package manager, which is pip. So we can see if pip is installed using pip -v or pip3-v. That should also get back, because Python version specific for the version 3 is pip version 3. As you can see, I have Python 3.6, but the latest version as of today is Python 3.9, which is fine, because I just want the Python installation, or the interpreter installed to get some work done with Python. Okay, so once this is done and pip is also installed, so we can get other packages installed as well. So one thing that I mentioned earlier on was we can have a virtual environment running. So we can see if the virtual environment is up and running first. Now we have the pip installed, but if you don't see the pip installed for some reason, it should have, if you have Python installed already, but just in case if you don't find it, you can head on to this packaging.python.org. I will also copy and put this link in the description below as well. You can get pip installed in this way: Python 3-m pip install user upgrade pip. So this way you can get the pip installed. And we also need to have a virtual environment. As I mentioned, virtual environment helps us isolate a Python executable and Python environment, so that we can have a very personalized environment for a particular project, so that we don't clutter the base Python installation and so forth, which is a great idea. So if a virtual environment is not installed, this is how you install it. So let's see how to create a virtual environment. So it says this is how you create it. So I'm just gonna copy that. Under a particular folder, I'm just going to use this thing. If this works, that means virtual environment is installed. It looks like it is. So as you can see, I have an env folder, under which I can now see some directories, which means it has created a personalized virtual environment. So to activate this environment, we just have to do source into the bin directory, and there are a couple of scripts underneath here. So we just have to source the activate script to run it in Windows, rather in Linux. If it's in Windows, you also should be able to find other relevant scripts in here. So once you do this, you will see the env and your shell change somewhat, indicating that you are now inside a virtual environment. So the next thing is to get other packages installed. So let's get Graphene installed for our GraphQL library get installed. So we'll first head on to we'll come to the installation of Django a little while later. So graphene-python.org. So you can download Graphene here. So once you go to the page, you can see different ways of getting Graphene. You can take it for Django, you can take it for SQL Alchemy, and various other types of Graphene libraries for different frameworks as well. So but to get the preliminary Graphene installed, so we can use this command over here. So I'm going to head on to our environment and now see how pip is visible under here. So now you can see we can install it using the pip command this way. So this should download Graphene and get it installed, and should be done in a couple of seconds. Okay, so now that says installation is done, successfully installed the GraphQL and Graphene and related libraries in Python. So next is to get Graphene Django installed. So before we do this thing, we need to have Django installed as well. So let's go head on to the Django website, djangoproject.com, and then click on download latest version 3.1.7 as of today. So I can use this command to get Django installed. So it should be pretty easy. So let me clear the window and then use it here, and this should get Django installed in a few seconds. Yeah, it's bringing in 3.1.7 version, and yes, and Django is installed. So now lastly, let's get Graphene Django installed, and there are the instructions here on setting up a Django project to use Graphene inside a Django project. So this is what you have to follow. So we'll have a look at this when we develop a Graphene Django project to develop a GraphQL API inside Django. So before that, we need to have Django installed. Okay. Right, so yes, now successfully installed Graphene Django, and this is all we have got for the prerequisites, and all the prerequisites are now done. With all the prerequisites installed, now let's look into how to implement a simple GraphQL functionality with Graphene, Python Graphene. So now I'm inside a folder. By the way, I'm working in my Mac. I'm back in Mac. I just showed the previous Ubuntu installations just for the sake of completion and to show how to do a certain installation. So I have Python, Graphene, Django, and all sorts of things installed in my virtual environment, so which I'm going to show you now. So I'm inside a directory named Python Graphene, and if you just look into that, I have a directory named Graphene environment and another directory called source. So what I actually did was I created a new directory named Graphene env, went into cd into that, and just created a new Python environment named inside that we using this command in this way. So that should create a set of directories like these for our Python environment. So going back, then I can activate my Python virtual environment using bin activate, and as you can see, it's activated because you can see the shell changed a little bit. And then once I'm inside the Python environment, I can do installation of all packages, the prerequisite packages which I just showed in Ubuntu. You can do the same in Mac as well using pip command. So I have Python 3 installed here, and now once you have this virtual environment activated, you can just consider it as a Python environment, just like your file system. So I have created a new directory called source. Underneath that, you find a couple of other directories which I created previously, so don't worry about that. So going into the general, this is where I have a couple of Python scripts which I'm going to use to explain how GraphQL can be implemented using Python Graphene. So let me open up this directory using Visual Studio Code. That way it will be a little easier for me to explain how things work. The first file that I'm interested to explain is the schema underscore query, which does nothing more than implementing a simple query type in GraphQL, which returns welcome to GraphQL. And I have imported Graphene here, and that's because that is what going to bring and make our Python code to implement GraphQL types, fields, and so forth. So I have a class named query which subclasses from graphene dot object type. So for this you need graphene package imported, and then we have one field named welcome, which is of string type. And now this query type is registered inside a schema, saying this is the root query type of our schema. And with this graphene.schema, inside brackets you can see query, inside parentheses you can see query equal query, which refers to this class. And so that's how it works. And then to create a resolver function for our query, we need to implement a simple function or a method underneath our query class named def resolve underscore and your type named welcome, which takes two parameters, self and info. So we'll come to the details of where the self and info parameters may come in handy. And in this case it's very simple, we are just returning a string named welcome to GraphQL. And then within the script, Python script itself, we are executing the GraphQL query. Typically this won't be the case. You will be executing a GraphQL query using a client-side code. If you have a GraphQL service, a client will be executing the GraphQL queries, but this will be a very good way of testing our GraphQL as well, the functionality that we have implemented. So it has the way of the client-side code can also be part of the simple script file. So schema.execute, and then within that I have a string which executes this query welcome and stores the response back in the result variable. And then it does nothing more than printing the response. So in the first statement it prints result.data.items, which will print out everything that is returned from the GraphQL operation that we just executed. And then this will specifically look into the welcome object. So we'll look into this when we execute the query. So let me get back to our function. You can also create a Python terminal inside here itself, a new terminal for example, and then use this location to execute, but I'm going to use my terminal here to do that. So Python 3 schema underscore query, and let's execute that. As you can see, you got the response. For example, if I just make it side by side for you to easily refer, yeah, look into this. For example, print result.data.items brought back a dictionary with my response. So for the welcome query, you got the response welcome to GraphQL. So that's why I used result.data.welcome. I specifically looked into that dictionary key, and it brought me back welcome to GraphQL string. And then I used that items and formed a proper dictionary because these are dictionary items, and I formed a dictionary here. and this is where this JSON module comes into play. So import JSON, and then I'm dumping the dictionary with JSON, and that will send back or return back a string with a proper JSON here. And as you can see, it's a JSON. And so this does nothing more than adding an indentation, proper indentation for formatting purposes. So that's pretty simple. That's a pretty simple query implementation of GraphQL using Graphene. And let's enhance this a little bit, and let's go to the query 2 and see what we are doing here. I just added another operation here, is permitted. It's nothing more than what we just did with welcome, and so I'm going to skip that because it just does the same. So let's go to the query 3. So this has a little bit of more details, and let's see how things work here. So I have a query which has this welcome and is permitted, like the one that I mentioned here. Only difference that I have here is I believe it's uh, a boolean type. So just to demonstrate that you can also have a boolean type in GraphQL. And as you can see in the resolver function, we are just returning a boolean here, and the schema is registered. And then you can also use is permitted here, and note how I have written it in the camel case instead of the snake case as in here. So that's something that Graphene expects. So there are also way to override that. So I'm going to just leave it as is, and for the moment just remember that Graphene expect it to be in camel case by default, right? And then here in this case you have is permitted, and there is also a new field named courses actually, and it is derived from this field called course, and as you can see it's a list. And there is also another additional parameter that it takes of type graphene dot int. It is to like determine how many courses that needs to be returned back. So for the timing, just forget about that. So it's basically a list of courses. So this course as an ID of type graphene.id. ID is also a field in GraphQL, and it has a name of type string, and also a created on which is of a date time type. And then we have a resolver function here which actually returns back three courses. As you can see, we are just creating it inside the resolver function itself with id1, a name saying learning GraphQL, and created on the current time, and then another course with learning Django and learning Flask and so forth. So as you can see, this num parameter is set to none by default, and otherwise if this num is available, so this slicing operation will only filter out that many like let's say if we passing 2 here, it will just return 2 instead of all 3, and so forth. So the remaining is just the same. So let's try to execute this and see. So let's first execute the familiar welcome function just to make sure that it works fine, and save it. And let me clear this out once again, or else we can just keep it this way for us to view it. So I'm gonna python 3 schema query 3, and as you can see, as expected, it just returns the welcome. So nothing is changed there. So then let's go to this is permitted. You should get a false of a boolean type. Let's see how it is returned instead. So as you can see, is permitted is returning a false. It's not a string, it's a boolean object, a boolean type. Even within the JSON, it brings back the proper JSON false value. So the other important operation is the one that I want to demonstrate in this particular type is this, how to execute this. And I'm in fact passing this courses, because courses is my query type, and and it returns the fields, all the fields that is available in the course field: id, name, and created on. And also remember the camel case that I specified here with is permitted is also applicable to the subfields. And I'm also passing a parameter. This is how you execute a query type with parameters in GraphQL. So I am passing in two, and you should just return two values here. Let's see how it is returning the values. And yeah, so the previous operation is the same thing. Yeah, so the with the indentation it's a bit clear, and I will leave the other two because we just explained it for the welcome. It's will be the same for the other complex operations as well. Now we can see only two values are written. So if I happen to include one here, you should only expect the first item. Obviously, as you expected, it does that. So it's controlled by the Python function, resolver function, and that's just to demonstrate how to accept an additional parameter with our query type and then do operations based on that. It's pretty simple, right? Okay, let's move on with these are the queries, and we'll also implement a proper uh, a GraphQL API with Graphene Django as well. So I'll come to that a bit later. So now let's talk about mutations. So the mutations in GraphQL does create, update, and delete functionality. In a CRUD operation in GraphQL, the read is supported with query. The remaining, the create, update, and delete, is facilitated with mutations. So now this is an enhanced version of that, or a little bit of a more detail is there in this particular function. You have a mutation related values here. So you have the course just as previously we have that, and I also have something called the content, course content, with course content type and the created by variable. So just it's another class with it becomes a graphene field as soon as you are subclassing it with graphene.object type. So it becomes a graphene field, and we had to register this. If that is registered, it becomes part of the schema. So now we have a root query type, which is also subclass from graphene.object type, and all the remaining things are as same as what I showed previously, and all the others are same. And now we have a create course, which is now inherited from graphene.mutation instead of graphene.object type, because this is gonna facilitate a mutation capability. And for the mutation, that means you have to create something, you have to pass something as well, right? So you have to pass in some values, and so those values you can define it using your arguments subclass, or the inner class of the create course mutation. So that argument specifies you we are only passing in name, and this name uh, parameter should be part of our mutate method. So that's the place where when you call the particular mutation called the create course, if that is called, this mutate method will be invoked. And basically we say mutate is called, just a print statement, and we create a course. So course is just a class. We just create that with an id, just hard-coded value here, and a name which is passed in the parameter, and created on is just set to the current date time. And then we return the create course with the type course, with the just created the course value, and this type should be then registered as a Python field with the proper field class being passed in as a parameter. And so the create content is also just same as the create course. As you can see, the content type is put inside the field with the course content class. And now this has two parameters, the content type and created by, which has to be passed, which needs to be passed into the mutate method, create content type and created by. And then a few other details are tested here, so I'm going to skip that part for now, and because I'll be explaining more of that in our proper API that we'll implement in a while. And then this mutation, just like the query type here, a mutation, root mutation needs to be created, and all the mutation that you are intending to be part of the schema needs to be specified. So I need to have a create course. With the create course field, which is a mutation uh, type, and you specify that as a field, and also the create content, and then this mutation needs to be part of it. So I'm going to skip all this because we just looked into all of those earlier on. And now let's see how to create a new course. Yeah. Or the content actually. So I'm going to skip this thing for a while actually, and let's create a new course with this, right? So a mutation is specified as mutation. So mutation, and then inside the parentheses we have to say what mutation. So the create course, and the only parameter that it expects is a name parameter, which is a string, as you can see here. It's just a one value. So I'm passing in a value called learning docker, and then it returns a course. The created course is returned. So as you can see, a create course is returned with the created course and with these values. So it has an ID, name, and created on, which I'm expecting to be returned from my mutation query. So let's try to execute this now. Yeah, I have this mutation, Python 3 schema underscore mutation. Yeah, so the created course is returned, pretty easy. And as you can see, my course with ID 7, learning Docker, and created on with the current date and time is also returned. And that's pretty easy. And now just to look into what the other one states. Now get courses query. Yeah, so that's a query that we can pass in, as you can see. Yeah, the courses query. Let's try to execute that. Now this is a simple query, right? Yeah, so let's first do this, and we looked at this earlier on as well. So this should return all the courses that we have. All these should be returned. Now make sure that we don't have anything else uncommented. Only the one that you need should be commented. And then let's try this. So it returns all the courses as expected. Then what happens here, in the next one, we pass in a parameter, right? We pass in a parameter number 2, which will be captured in this, and you will only get the first two values as expected. You should have that. You get only the first two. So let's look at the other one. So what I wanted to emphasize here is how to pass in a variable, how to pass in a parameter using a variable. So this is this just demonstrates that. So as you can see, the courses query has this num value captured as a variable $num, and now this $num should be captured, and that is passed in using this value called the variable values num and the value. And now that needs to be captured inside our query, and that is done using query. And we can name this query anything. In my case, I have just named it as get courses query. And then we have to specify the parameters that we are trying to pass in here. So the $num and the type int. So when we do this thing, what happens is this value 2 will be passed into $num, and that we are substituting here. So let's for the purpose, let's take it as 1. This should only return 1. Simple, right? And yeah, the remaining stuff just demonstrates the same thing. So I'll leave it at that on this simple thing, now you get a very basic understanding of how we can implement a GraphQL query and a mutation using Graphene. Now, in real world, now when we created this with this create course thing, as you can look into here, we are not actually doing anything rather than creating this course on the fly and returning, and it's not getting persisted as well. So to do those persistence and all those things, we need to have a proper a persistence layer. So this is where I'm going to create a proper GraphQL API using Django, because Django has an internal object relational mapping, and we can use the inbuilt or the simple database named SQLite 3, which comes pre-shipped with Django to demonstrate that. So that way we can have a proper working GraphQL API created. Let's look into that next. Okay, now let's look into how to create a proper GraphQL API using Django and Graphene. So for that, let me just go back and step into the Git test. You see a folder named bookstore sample GraphQL. So this is a Git repository, so which I clone using my repository here. So I'll put the link to this repository, a sample GraphQL API. So you can take this and clone it, and for that you need to have the Git client installed as well. So let me step into that and then open this directory. Okay, so by the way, I have also got this thing, a blog post that I wrote some time ago. So creating GraphQL API using Python, Graphene, and Django. The same thing is described here. So I'll put the link to this blog post in the description below as well, so you can follow that along, and all this is explained in detail as well. So so next thing is I have a new a project created. So Django admin start project app. So you will first create for example a directory. In this case I have created a new directory named app, and then step into that, and then that's for the organization purposes, and then I have used Django admin start project app. So this will create a new Django project which will create an application app folder and few other relevant files like the manage.py. Now if you just go into the app folder, you will see all the settings files and all the Django specific details inside that, a schema file, settings file, URLs, a file, whiskey.py file, and so forth. So this is not a Django tutorial, so I'm not going into details of describing what that settings file contains and what the URLs .py file is for, and so forth. I'm not going there in this particular tutorial, but I'll leave it for you to figure that out, and I expect that you are a little conversant with Django as well. Because this is a GraphQL tutorial, I'm just trying to focus on the GraphQL part of it. Okay, so as you can see, there are two more folders here, the users folder and the books folder. The users folder is just a folder which you can create this way, and but the books folder is not merely a folder. So if you just go into that, you see some other files related to that. So it's basically a Django application. It's a good practice in Django to organize your functionality inside your base Django project as applications. So you can have a books application, and it's logical as well, right? So you have to logically think what constitute a application within your bigger project. And so in my case, this is going to be a simple bookstore like thing. So I'm going to have an application called the books. So in my here you see a Python 3 manage.py start app book, and once you do that thing, you will have this books folder. So in fact it should be books here, and so you can have it as books, and then once you have that, and now I have my files opened here. Let me just go here and then look into the books. So now the books application inside, it's a Django application. You will have all the Django specific files as well, named models.py. So this will be created for you by default. So once you step into that, so in my case I already have a model defined. You will see an empty file here, and here I'm bringing in django.db import models. And for the time being, just for the moment, forget about this. I'll come back to that. So this model constitute of how what we want to persist, for example. And this is an object relational mapping concept in Django. You can all these fields will convert into a database column in a proper database table as well, and a database schema. And I have a title field, author field, description field, and you can see the title field is a car field with max length of 50. Author is also a car field. Description needs to be a little longer, so I chose a text field instead of that. Publisher book URL is a URL field, and released on the date time field, and it has an automatic value added as auto now add value this. So this value is a foreign key for another table, which brings in a default table. I'll come back to this a while later. And now this, once this is ready, now this is our schema, or this is our model for the database, right? And now we need to have a GraphQL schema that should interact with this particular database model to query data out of this table, and to add mutations, to create new uh, uh, book values inside this table and so forth. So that's where the schema.py file is coming in. So you have to create this schema.py file underneath the books folder. And once you are inside, and I have details already specified, so I'm gonna explain to you what I have done here step by step. So let's look into something called this book type. So book type is a class, and it inherits from the Django object type. So which actually is part of the Graphene Django project. So it's not part of the base Graphene project, but Graphene Django project. So Django object type is used instead of the Graphene dot object type, which you saw earlier when we demonstrated a simple query type. And underneath that we have a inner class named meta that states the model that we are dealing with here is the book model. And so the book model is defined here, right? So now this file needs to be imported, this thing, so which is what we have done here, from dot models import book, so that way this book is visible inside this particular file. And then we have a class named query, which inherits from the graphene.object type as earlier. And for that I have imported the graphene just as earlier. And we have a field named books, which is a list of this book type. And we also have another additional parameter of type string. So this parameter will be passed inside, or expected inside, our resolver function for this books query. So that is a search query. For the time being, just forget about this search, because expecting it to be none, you can also pass in or ignore that. That's what this none means. So if a value exists, you will come into here, otherwise we'll be returning all the books that are available in our database. So that's pretty simple. So that's about a query type. So now about the mutation, because we also spoke about mutation earlier on. And we have this mutation class which inherits from the graphene dot mutation. And now we need to create a new book, right? So the book type is of type book type with graphene dot field, and the arguments that we expect to create a book type. Now this book type contains these different fields, right? So we need to capture all these things from the GraphQL mutation query. So a title, author, and the publisher book URL is expected. And so these values will be available in this mutate method with this cogs variable. Otherwise you can also simply use this way as well. I'm just writing this for the purpose of showing you. So you can also expand this in this way as well, description and then publisher book URL. But the problem with this particular methodology is, like, if you have like 10 or 15 arguments to be passed in, that becomes a little clumsy here. So I don't want to do that thing. So Python supports a very simple way of capturing all those variables in a single variable, and then you can access that using the get method of that quarks and passing in the parameter name as I have done here, quarks.get. So let's delete this. So just to, and user is taken in, and now I haven't explained to you anything about a user yet. So this is where this other model, the get user model, and the posted user foreign key of the table comes into play. I'll come to that in a while, but let's try to understand what I have done here. And then with these values I have created a books model, an instance of the book, passing in the title, author, description, and the publisher URL, and that will create a book, right? And then a book.save will save it in the underlying database, right? So once you have that thing, we return the create book with the field book. So this is the GraphQL requirement, so that will return it. So we do a similar thing for the update as well. I'll leave you to experiment with that, and also the delete one. It's pretty easy. The delete one actually takes a book id, which is an integer, and then we look into this book with an id. So even though we don't have an id here, GraphQL, in fact Django, automatically adds an id table, id column, and that's the id column that we are expecting here. So that's the id that you need to pass in as well. And once we have that thing, we do book.delete, and then we return the delete book with the book id, and then we also register all the mutations. Now you see, the mutation class is specified here, but this is not the root mutation and the root query. For that, we are doing something called in the app.schema.py file, and we have a root query here, and you can specify all the available query types that you are intending to have in your application, all the GraphQL apps. Now this has a books thing, and later on you might also bring in something called publications, for example, or maybe video tutorials or something like that. So that itself may have queries and mutations, and it's always good to have a root level, and then this class will be subclassed with those types. So user schema.query, books schema.query, and it will be inherited with the graphene.object type, and that's just a registration, and this class will then be passed into the schema. And as you can see, the mutation uses the users mutation, books mutation as well. So these three, I'm just trying to explain it now, so we'll come to that. And so if you look into my blog post, for example, I also ask you to install, in addition to Django, Graphene Django, I didn't show this in this tutorial earlier on, but you better install these two packages using pip as well, Django GraphQL JWT. So JWT stands for JSON Web Token. Then we are going to use that for authentication purposes, right? So that's where this user model comes in. So this Django is a comprehensive framework, and it provides you an authentication framework as well. It provides us with a default user model. It has details like username, password, and many other common attributes that we normally capture when it comes to modeling a user. So that will be useful for us to reuse in this type of a scenario. So django.contrib.auth, we are importing the get user model, and that is the user model that I'm using as a foreign key here, right? And then I use on delete cascade, so which means if I delete the user, all the related books to that particular user will also be deleted, is what that means, right? So we can also omit if that is not what you want, but normally that is the practice that we see in common implementation, so you can leave it as it is, right? So in the schema, you can go back to the places where that is expected. So we do install, let's say for example, this JWT Django GraphQL JWT value. And then that is what I have specified here, the token or the verify token and the refresh token. You can bring that three value here and specify here. So which means I'm gonna tell for you to authenticate, you need to for you to mutate something and query something, you need to be authenticated. So that's exactly what is one of the users of this info. So info will get the user out of the context, and we'll see if the user is anonymous or not. If user is anonymous, which means is not authenticated, we are just throwing something, raising an exception called GraphQL error, which I have also imported using the GraphQL here, and specify a string there. If that is passed, you can go do the other operations in the mutate operation. Like I previously mentioned, for the query also we do the authentication, but apparently we are not doing that. And Yeah, so we are using this search query. Like search I didn't explain yet, I'll come back to that in a while. And otherwise, for the mutation we need to have the person logged in. Now let's try to run this GraphQL API. For example, I have this here. First of all, once you have your models created, now I have only one model here and also another model brought in. You need to tell Django that you have these models in place and to do all the migrations. To do that, you need to run two commands. Once you have this in place, you need to run python manage.py make migrations. I have already done that, I'm not going to run it, but you can do that. So once you have that thing, any modification that you do in any of the models.py underneath your GraphQL project, once you are done and once you know the functionalities, then you have to run the make migrations, and then you have to run manage.py migrate. So it will make sure all those changes that you have applied in those models are reflected in the underneath database. So in our case, this will create something called db.sqlite3. When you do that thing first, you won't find that file, and once you run the migrations, you will have that file, and that's because SQLite is the default database that is supported in the Django. For example, if you go into the apps settings, you will see that database mentioned inside here. So the databases, as you can see in the current directory, it specifies as db.sqlite3. So you can change the name if you want it to be something else, if you're intending to go with SQLite itself. Otherwise, normally you will also use other relational database management systems like Postgres or MySQL or Oracle, for example, or even MS SQL. So once you have that, we can also specify our applications here. So I had to specify my application under installed apps books, and I also need to bring in the Graphene Django, remember that, and also the course header which I installed earlier on. And then I need to specify this additional value to tell that this exposes a middleware for JSON Web Token for authentication purposes. So make sure that you include this value as well, and once you clone it, you can have a look at it. And installed middlewares, you can see this authentication middleware. We need to have this authentication middleware brought in. If that is not already there, bring that in. And authentication backends, so this is for the JWT, so make sure that you have those two as well in your other projects if you are intending to make this as a reference. Yeah, so once that is there, you can start running your application. So once you do the make migrations and then you do migrate, and then once you are done with it, we can use the inbuilt testing server to test our application. So Python, yeah, looks like it is already something else is running, so we'll come back to that. Okay, so I had another server running, so let me try, I switch that off now, and now let's run this again. Okay, now we have it running. So I just wanted to like quickly mention one more thing. So in the urls.py, I have also included this GraphQL slash GraphQL thing that imports GraphQL view as view, which brings in this GraphQL app for us to query. So it's an IDE for us to do simple queries as well. So let's try to use that. Um, so let's see, HTTP the localhost 8000. So I can use GraphQL or GraphQL. Um, yeah, it brings back what we need. So let's try to run our query. So if you just look into this docs directory, you will see all the queries and mutations that we have. If you just go into the queries, you will see the books, book as a search string, the book returns a book type, and so forth. Let's try to query all the books here. So our query has books. Let's see, books, and so this book has ID. uh, we can say, what else do we have in this book type? A title, author, and description. Title, author, description, and many other things actually. So let me try to call this. As you can see, I have three books already in place, so it's persisted, and I think it's something that I created earlier on. You see those values here. So that's what the query is all about. So a user, you have to use an ID. You have to pass an ID, and then it will bring back a user. Let's try to uh, use the user's query, user, and I need to pass a ID, and let me pass one. I'm not sure whether we have one, but let's see. And it will return an ID, password, and we have username. Let's try that. ID, username, and let me also use password and see what it is there. Okay, I have a username, Shazni, and I have a password, a hash password written. So it doesn't return uh, clear text password there, which is a good thing for security purposes. Yeah, so we have a user here now, and so that's about users and queries, right? uh, Queries. So we also have mutations here. um, so right, so for mutations, I need to use some other client. GraphQL doesn't support mutation type of queries. So I'm going to use Postman. Postman now recently supported GraphQL for us to query and even to do mutations. You can use it as a proper GraphQL client for you to use. Right. Let's try that. So I have a GraphQL. I have these books which I just demonstrated for you using the GraphQL query. And if I execute this, you should get all the three books that we just had, and I actually bring in other details as well. And yeah, so now we have that. So let's go to the create book. Create book is a mutation, right? So we have a mutation, and then we have a mutation. We have to specify that as a mutation, otherwise it will take it as a normal query. And then we have our mutation named create book, for which we are passing in author, um, and title, description, and publisher, book URL. So these are the ones that we specified in our model, right? So we are passing in that, and then we are asking to return the book. So for example, if you just look into the create book, it returns the create book type, which is of book type. So you can ask for all these fields. So let's see what happens when we try to execute this. Right. So we are getting a 200 OK, but with an errors field says user must logged in to create a book. Now, why is this happening? So let's look into our code, and this is something that I intentionally implemented. And for example, in the create book, you see we are expecting a user to be logged in, and if not, the user must be logged in to create a book will be returned. Now, how to get the user logged in? Now we have a couple of users created already, and you see that user is created. For example, you saw in the users query, you got that thing. We can also create these users manually inside Python Django admin portal as well. I'm not sure whether that is enabled. Let me see if it is enabled. We can show that to you. Yes, I think it looks like it is enabled. Let me try that. Maybe the super user. I need to create a super user for this. Once we have the super user in place, we can create that. But because I have a user already, let's go with the demonstration first. Otherwise, you can create a super user using, for example, you can use python 3 manage.py create super user, something along that. So you can also refer the documentation to how to create a super user with a password, and that can be used to log into the Python Django admin portal, and then you can create these users as you want. For example, let me try using this. I'm not sure what was my password. Let me try. Looks like it's not a super user, but anyhow, so we cannot use that, but I have a user in place. Now how do I log in? So this is where our JWT the application that I specified earlier, that module comes into play, and we can use that to authenticate and take a token which we can use to pass in to mutate method to make sure that token is a valid token for a authenticated user. So which we can do it in this way. So for example, now we specified in our root schema, we have something called token auth and verify token and refresh token. So this token auth is the way that we can also create a new user here. For example, if you want to create a new user, you can create this way. So let's try to create a username David, for example. We can use that user, create user. Yeah, so the user is created, so there is only one user, so that's why you got the ID 2. So user is created now with the username David, and the password is also David, right? So now we can use this user as well, right? So first, for that, we need to get a get JWT token. So for get JWT token, I'm using this token auth query. So as you can see, it's token underscore auth, but Graphene expects it to be in the camel case, and I'm passing in my username and password and taking that value back. So now this returns a token for me, and this token can be used now to create a new book, for example. So for that, we need to use a header named authorization with the value JWT, and then you have to issue your token, for example. So I can use this to create a new book. So let's say let me create a author named Shazmi. With Graphene, with Graphene in action. Yeah, just a few additional details there. So once we do that thing, now the book is created. So this is how the authentication thing works in with mutations. Now if you just ask for, let's say, books, all the books, I should see 4 books instead of 3 books, because it's persisted, right? Perfect. And you can also use update. I'll leave you to experiment with that. So let's use a delete book example. So delete, I'm gonna use a book ID. So as you can see in my previous query, you had uh, like you had an ID, for example. So I can use that ID to delete a book as well. I'm gonna pause in 3 to make sure whether that book is getting deleted, for example. So when I use this, um, yeah, so the book is deleted, and if I use get books, I should not see that. Now in this delete book, I'm also using this authorization JWT, which I previously uh, took from another authentication call, token auth call. So that's why it worked. Otherwise, like if I just use untick that and use, for example, 4 here, I should now get a authentication failure. So this is pretty simple, right? So now this particular application, GraphQL API, you can extend it to have more models bring in, and you can use all the Django facilities available, and get a complex API done pretty easy, right? So that's all I have got for today. I hope you enjoyed seeing how GraphQL APIs can be implemented using Python, Graphene, and Django. Hope to see you on another day. Do subscribe to my channel here, and for you to see more videos like this. I'll be also creating more videos of other types of GraphQL if possible. Uh, we'll see you on another day. Take care.